Good afternoon and welcome to everybody who's attending the meeting today. In line with the restrictions issued by the Victorian Government on public gatherings due to COVID-19, the public gallery for the meeting is closed and the meeting is being held virtually and publicly live streamed in keeping with the good practice guidelines issued by the Minister for Local Government. My name is Nolene Duff and I'm the chair of the panel of administrators, and I'd like to welcome my colleague panel members today, Mr. Miguel Belmar.
Good evening.
And Mr. Cameron Boardman.
Good afternoon, Chair.
And I also welcome, we're joined this afternoon by Mr. Glenn Patterson, our Chief Executive Officer, and the officers present assisting the meeting are Jacinta McLeod and Jordan Barfoot, so welcome. The Statement of Acknowledgement. The City of Casey proudly acknowledges the traditional owners, Casey's Aboriginal communities and their rich culture, and pays respect to their elders past, present and future. We acknowledge Aboriginal people as Australia's first peoples and as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work and live. The Diversity Statement. The City of Casey is home to a remarkable diversity of cultures, languages, faiths, identities, landscapes and stories. From our first Australians to our most recent arrivals and every wave between, the City of Casey welcomes and represents all community members and their respective ambitions to live healthy, rewarding and happy lives. These intersecting and overlapping community stories form Casey's collective identity and contribute to its evolving rich history. We recognise this diversity as our strength and we aim to share, nurture and celebrate it. I now move to item 2 on the agenda, the confirmation of minutes. That's the minutes of the council meeting held on the 6th of October 2020. Do I have a mover and seconder?
I'll move those.
Mr. Belmar moved, and a seconder? Mr. Boardman. Thank you. All in favour? Carried unanimously. Item 3, declaration of interests. I've considered my obligations under the Local Government Act and do not have a conflict of interest relevant to any matters on the agenda papers this afternoon. I also note that no officers have declared conflicts in reports presented. Do my fellow administrators have any conflict of interest to declare?
I have nothing to declare, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman.
Apologies, Mr. Boardman. I have no conflicts of interest.
Thank you. Now move to public question time, and we have had a significant number of public questions this afternoon, all generally in relation to item 5.3 on the agenda, the Rosemore Gallery Advisory Committee. We've had a total of 83 questions. And as we're not going to be able to deal with all of those questions individually, I have a series of themes. There are 12 themes against which I will identify both the author of the various questions and the question numbers and a summary of the theme and a response. So there's quite some considerable reading in this, so you'll have to bear with me through the next several minutes. So I'll start with theme number 1. And that general theme is the change in council. There are a number of public questions that related to the recent dismissal of Casey's councillors who'd previously considered the Rosemore Gallery proposal and the integrity process and appropriateness of the Casey panel of administrators' consideration of the proposal. The questions related to this theme were posed by Bruce Wood, Matthew Wills, Jessie Wills, Gavin Johnson, Sue Wild and Jennifer Black, and they relate to question numbers 1, 9, 13, 21, 33 and 76. And by way of response to the matters raised, the proposal that is being considered this afternoon by the City of Casey panel of administrators is being done without any influence or reference to the former council's consideration of the matter. The proposal presented today in item 5.3 is quite different from the proposal discussed with the former City of Casey councillors, and that's evident in the two reports that were released by the panel last week, which were formally declared as confidential reports. So it's clear as to the matters that were considered by the previous council. But our role and obligation as a panel this afternoon is to review the officer report and recommendation, which we have done, and to now at the council meeting today to debate the matter and to resolve the recommendation with or without changes, or to not adopt any recommendation. It should also be noted that this is a matter that is not within Council's control or decision making, as the proponent is proceeding with this proposal through a ministerial panel appointed by the Minister for Planning. Council is a stakeholder in this process, and whilst we certainly encourage the engagement and submissions through the panel process, the ministerially appointed panel process, the closing date of that is the 6th of November. Nevertheless, the panel has benefited from the issues raised in the questions, and I do confirm to all those who have posed questions that all of the 83 questions in their integrity were circulated fully to both Mr. Belmar and to Mr. Boardman when they were received yesterday. While IBAC's Operation Sandon hearings have not yet concluded, it's not appropriate to address questions and allegations in this forum. Suffice to say that the investigation of Operation Sandon has a focus on some very specific planning matters, and this matter of the agenda item 5.3 today is not within the purview of the investigation being undertaken by IBAC, and that's in the public realm currently. Theme 2 has been considered under the heading of community consultation, and the public questions were about what previous community consultation council conducted for the proposal. And the questions related to this have come from Philip Batty, Jessie Wills, Gavin Johnson, April Harnwell, Steve Harnwell, Sue Wild, Marilyn Ferguson, Christine Weaver, Warwick Glendenning, John Council and Carolyn Collins, and they relate to question numbers 4, 12, 20, 24, 30, 32, 35, 38, 53, 60, 68 and 70. The city, and broadly in response to that, the answer is that the City of Casey has not conducted an independent public consultation with residents about the Rosemore project, as we are not the relevant authority considering the matter in this instance, that being the Minister for Planning. However, we understand that the state government has directly notified owners and occupiers of land immediately surrounding the site that they have assessed as relevant and is facilitating the current Ministerial Advisory Committee, that process to ensure that public consultation occurs before any decision is made on the project. I've been informed that council officers' recommended submission attached to report item 5.3 before council today is informed by a review of all the exhibited documents considering relevant state and local policy and preliminary consultation with the state government and the proponent. During that consultation, I'm advised that council officers have stressed the need for quality building and site design, adequate parking and provision of all necessary infrastructure to serve the development to avoid any unreasonable impacts to the neighbourhood. The panel will consider the appropriateness of the officer report and recommendations in this regard when the item is considered in the agenda this afternoon. And can I say that the panel have reviewed all of the material available in the public realm, that being made available by the panel. And as most of those questioners have familiarity with that, it's quite extensive and detailed and covers many, many elements with expert reports, etc. So we have all reviewed those documents. Theme 3 is internal consultation across council departments, and this covers questions inquiring about the extent of internal consultation that was done to inform council's draft submission and the extent of officer work undertaken thus far reviewing this proposal and the cost of that work. And these questions came from Jenny Adams, Scott Hamilton, Sonia Murphy, Michael Hawkins, Carolyn Collins, Sophie Utting, Tim Bayard and Mark Saffin, and they were question numbers 226, 28, 36, 42, 71, 72 and 83. And in response to that, I've been informed that council officers across the various teams have conducted in-depth review of the exhibited documents for the Rosemore proposal. An internal working group made up of council officers from over a dozen teams, including art, sustainability, environment, which was the subject of several of the questions that have been raised in our question time today, have reviewed the proposal and provided input that informed the draft submission now before council today. I'm advised that costs to review the proposal have included regular officer time, and council did in 2019, prior to the panel, sought the services of a specialist legal counsel for a modest fee to advise on whether the language of an earlier version of the draft amendments incorporated document would properly ensure the concern that council officers had that the art collection was of state significance and would remain at the site in perpetuity. Theme 4 is questions about Rosemore's consistency with the Green Wedge policy and the Casey planning scheme. Several questions were received asking why council would support an amendment to the Casey planning scheme to facilitate the project, and concerns expressed about the project setting a precedent for more intense development throughout the Casey Foothills Green Wedge A zone. These questions came from Philip Batty, Sally Ann Batty, Stephen Gowes, Bruce Odgers, Steve Harnwell, Donald Ferguson, Ines Tynan, Heidi Rees, Rosalie Council, Peter Vandenberg, Mark Saffin and Cheryl Thomas, and they relate to question numbers 5, 6, 11, 18, 22, 31, 40, 48, 56, 64, 65, 75 and 82. And in response to that, it's important to note that the Green Wedge zone does allow exhibition centres, including art galleries, but does not allow the art gallery with a restaurant and 2 dwellings as proposed in the Rosemore project without a specific amendment. If, after receiving advice from the advisory committee, the Minister for Planning deems this to be a project of state significance and allows it to proceed, then a site-specific amendment would be applied to this site only. This zoning tool is called a specific control overlay, and it can be used where a special allowance or change to the planning scheme is desired at an individual site for a specified reason or a specific proposal. It would include an incorporated document that runs with the land, similar to a planning permit. In Rosemore's case, this document could include conditions on a number of matters, such as road improvements, parking, utilities, facility operations and site and building design. Should this proposal be supported by the Minister, the site-specific approach would allow the proposal to proceed, but ensure that the project's design is sensitive to the rural Green Wedge character of the site and surroundings. The amendment would not change the existing Green Wedge A zoning that applies to any other land in Harkaway. The use of the site-specific control is done by exception, and I do note there are only 10 properties in Casey with this overlay in place currently. For this proposal, if approved, the exception would relate to the proposal being of such significance to the broader state of Victoria that it warrants consideration and deviation from the normal provisions of the Green Wedge zone. And that is no doubt a matter that the advisory panel appointed by the Minister will consider in great depth. Theme 5, upholding the best interests of the community. Public questions about whether Council is upholding its duty of care to the community in supporting the proposal at this location. Related questions include whether other locations better served by infrastructure and services have been considered or suggested by Council, and how will Council verify the art collection's value and whether the collection will remain in Casey. These questions were raised by April Harnwell, Annie McCreish, Ines Tynan, Brian and Margaret Quirk, and Sue Axelson. And they were question numbers 25, 49, 62, 69 and 81. In response to the questions around this theme, I'm confident that Council officers have carefully considered the Rosemore proposal's significant cultural and economic benefits, as well as the potential impacts of the project upon its surroundings. However, they are matters that finally the panel appointed by the Minister will deliberate and determine and provide advice to the Minister about. The panel appointed by the Minister will consider the appropriateness and the extent to which the potential impacts, such as car parking access, bushfire design and general amenity, is reflected in the report and recommendations when the item is considered in the agenda this afternoon. Other sites in Casey have not been proposed by the applicant for the Rosemore project, and like all planning matters, the assessment must be made on the facts of the proposal before us. It is not for Council to recommend other sites. Additionally, ensuring the significance that the art collection has and the fact that it should remain in Casey is a central concern, and any proposed conditions on this topic contained in the planning scheme amendment would ensure the value of the art collection will be properly verified and that collection remains in Casey should this amendment be supported by the Minister ultimately. Theme 6 is about the general topic of the lack of public transport and the impacts of the proposal on the transportation system. And questions were around how can the proposal be supported in a location not served by public transport? How will the project impact the transportation system? And whether is there any proposal to provide local street connectivity east from the site by extending Sewell Drive Harkaway to connect with Luke Place in Cardinia Shire? These questions were posed by Sally Ann Batty, Sophie Utting, Steve Harnwell, Stephen Gowes, Janet Wills, Garrick Gallard, Matthew Morris, Sue Wild, Peter Watson and Jennifer Black, and related to questions submitted numbers 7, 10, 14, 29, 31, 34, 50, 54, 59 and 77. Local and state planning policy seeks the consolidation of commercial and institutional land uses in areas served well by multiple modes of transportation, and especially in activity centres with public transportation connections. Tourism opportunities are also encouraged in Melbourne's Green Wedge areas where there are few public transportation services. The benefits of Green Wedge tourism and economic development opportunities such as Rosemore Gallery must be weighed against a range of other considerations such as the lack of public transportation. Council officers have assessed the proposed road access to the Rosemore site, and officers support the proposal to provide a widened and sealed King Road to accommodate anticipated traffic volumes. There has been no proposal to provide a local street connection to the site from the east, and such a connection is not assessed as needed to serve the development. Theme 7 is generally with respect to concerns about Harkaway traffic impacts and safety. Questions asked whether Council has considered local traffic and safety impacts of increased traffic through the school zone in Harkaway and on an unsealed Baker Road north of King Road. These questions have been raised by Cheryl Thomas, Christine Weaver and Emily Thomas and relate to questions number 17, 19 and 52. And in reply, officers have assessed the proposed development will result in some increased traffic and congestion in Harkaway during the afternoon peak. The area in front of the primary school on King Road in Harkaway Village would experience, as assessed by council officers, some increased congestion during the afternoon student pickup time, but will remain essentially a low speed and congested traffic environment with no expected changes to pedestrian or vehicle safety. Regarding the concern about increased traffic on unsealed Baker Road north of King Road, it is anticipated that most of the traffic for the development will use the arterial network and local road network of Harkaway Road and King Road, with the majority coming from the west and the south. Therefore, council would not find that improvements to Baker Road are warranted by the proposal based on the project's anticipated traffic volumes. Theme 8, the implications of improving King Road. Various public questions were received concerning the implications of widening and sealing King Road, including tree and vegetation loss, impacts to Walsdorf Creek, questioning the findings of the proponent's traffic study and the costs of needed road improvements. These questions were posed by Jenny Adams, Tim Bayard, Julie McEwen, Marilyn Ferguson, Anne Reynolds, Peter Watson, Sue Axelson and Scott Hamilton, and related to question numbers 3, 37, 39, 45, 47, 58, 62 and 73. And in response, the officers have advised the widening and sealing of King Road as required by the proposed planning scheme amendment conditions, if they were approved by or suggested by the panel and approved by the Minister, would be regarded as accommodating the expected traffic generation, provide improved access for service vehicles, buses and emergency vehicles, and reduce council's maintenance costs when compared to the cost of maintaining a gravel road. If the amendment facilitating Rosemore is approved by the state government, it is possible that additional permits for off-site works associated with King Road upgrades could be needed when detailed plans for King Road are prepared and submitted to council for review. These could include tree and vegetation removal permits and other related assessment of wildlife drainage and the capacity of Walsdorf Creek culvert. It is assumed that the proponent, as developer of the facility, will be responsible for the infrastructure costs such as King Road upgrades. Theme 9 is biodiversity and environmental protection. Multiple questions were asked about how council will ensure the proposal is consistent with council's biodiversity strategy. These questions were posed by Matthew Wills, Janet Wills, Sonia Murphy, Emily Thomas, Sally Taylor, Sophie Utting, Tim Bayard, Michael Hawkins, Mark Saffin, Heidi Rees and Chloe Imrie, and relate to questions number 8, 15, 16, 27, 28, 36, 43, 57, 66, 78 and 83. Harkaway is identified as a biodiversity hotspot in the Casey Biodiversity Strategy. The proponent has submitted an arboricultural assessment demonstrating that no native vegetation will be removed from the site with this project. The Casey planning scheme did not trigger the need for further assessments of wildlife impacts for the site. Increased traffic along King Road could present a significant risk to wildlife, and this issue may be reviewed by the advisory committee and as part of the future assessment of detailed plan for King Road upgrades. King Road upgrades and the installation of reticulated water and sewer to the site would likely involve vegetation removal and the need for further assessment of native vegetation and wildlife impacts. Likewise, the future sealing of King Road will require an assessment of stormwater drainage and any impacts to creeks. Theme 10, Bushfire Risk. Concerns were raised about the risk of bushfires at the site and whether emergency access is sufficient. And those questions came from Bruce Odgers, Anne Reynolds, Garrick Gallard, Matthew Morris, Sally Taylor, Chloe Imrie, Julie McEwen, Donald Ferguson and Peter Vandenberg. and relate to question numbers 23, 41, 44, 46, 51, 55, 67, 74 and 79. I've been informed that council officers and the state government have consulted with the Country Fire Authority during preliminary discussions about the proposal prior to public exhibition. As a result, the proposed plans and amendment documents make provision for emergency fire access and bushfire and landscape management plan requirements. The CFA have also been consulted by the state government, I'm advised, through the exhibition, and the CFA will directly input to the advisory committee on any additional requirements or concerns related to bushfire safety. Theme 11, site visit. Have the administrators or council officers visited the site and surroundings? These questions were posed by Warwick Glendinging and Sue Axelson, question number 61 and 63. Due to the restrictions because of COVID, I do confirm that the administrators have not visited the site. However, several council officers across different areas of council have visited the site on a number of occasions and its surrounds, and that's been used to inform the submission. The panel members have reviewed aerial vision and obviously the plans associated with the site. Theme 12, how will the proposal impact the Equestrian Trail? This is question number 80 posed by Chloe Imrie. I'm advised that the existing Equestrian Trail would need to be retained along King Road, but shifted to an appropriate off-road design trail running alongside the paved section of King Road, should the proposal proceed. The existing public equestrian trail running north-south connecting the Rosemore site to Farm Lane would be retained when that strip of land is upgraded to an emergency unsealed fire access. That concludes the series of questions today, and I thank those people who've posed the questions. They've put a lot of thought and effort into that exercise. So I hope that you feel that we have addressed those questions as well as we could in this limited time. We've spent nearly half an hour. So that concludes the questions. And now I move on, panel members, to the officer reports, and there are 7 officer reports this afternoon. The first item is item 5.1, which is Council's Annual Report 2019-20, and I call for a mover for that report.
I will move that report, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman, and a seconder.
I'll second that.
Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman, please speak to the motion.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for your comprehensive answers to those questions. We will make some further comments in relation to that matter at the appropriate agenda item 5.3. But what I would like to do now is to move the recommendations associated with item 5.1 related to the annual report. That is a requirement under the Local Government Act, under section 131, in fact. And in doing so, I note that this report has, and its financial statements, has been forwarded to the Minister for Local Government as per the statutory obligation on the 30th of September. There are 3 components to this: the annual report, the auditor's report and the financial statements, and the performance statement, and also, as I've just mentioned, the requirement to submit that to the Minister. It is important to note that this year's financial statements up to 30 June 2020 has resulted in an unqualified audit, which does provide some health and robustness to the Council's finances. And as we have discussed the budget for this financial year and foreshadowed further review of the strategic and corporate plan for the municipality over forthcoming years, and we're taking a longer term horizon to that, consistent with the new requirements under the Local Government Act. We do note that we are still in a period, obviously, of economic strain for many of our ratepayers and many of our residents, and that the provisions that we have recently adopted and in fact extended in relation to hardship relief for ratepayers and ensuring we're not applying interest or penalty interest to pay unpaid rates remains, and we will, as we've indicated, given further consideration to that on an ongoing basis. Within the report that I do encourage as many residents and ratepayers within Casey to review is, of course, the council plan on page 10 of the council documents. There is reference to the outcomes and the implications of Operation Sandon, which also is something that remains topical considering some of the questions that were raised by community representatives earlier in this meeting. And importantly, the financial performance on page 27 of the council reports, but most importantly, commencing on page 83 of the council report and 100 page 49 of the report itself, going into details about the financial performance, including all of the development contributions that we have received over the forthcoming financial, or the previous financial year, I should say, the grants that we have given out to community organisations, and the detailed statement of the council's performance measurement, which is an important reference for administrators to ensure that council is meeting its corporate objectives and that all of the aspects that we have included in the corporate plan are being delivered adequately and commensurate with the community's expectations. In making that comment, Chair, it is important to note that we do again take a 4-year horizon on the performance measurement targets. 4 years going back to 2015-2016, and the indications are showing that there is significant improvement in the range of the strategic indicators, and that we are very confident that those strategic objectives and the forthcoming aspects of the council plan will continue to be improved commensurately. So I do say that this is a significant report, albeit for myself and Mr. Belmar, we have only been party to what's actually in this report for only 6 weeks. We were appointed in mid-May, and this report and the financial statements is up to the 30th of June of this year. But it does provide some significant indication on what the future plan of the council is, not just on the improved governance and the structures and the reporting mechanisms that we have ensured that are now commonplace within the council and have improved the operational efficiency of the organisation as a whole, but it also gives clarity to the community as what our future directions are, how we are better going to be serving the community's expectations on providing better service delivery accordingly, and most importantly, and consistent with our community engagement plan and our transparency obligations, reporting diligently, extensively and effectively all of those measures that we have set out to do so. So with those comments, Chair, I'm pleased to move the 3 recommendations and encourage members of the community who have an interest to review the annual report, and thank all council officers involved in producing such a high quality document.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, I'll just make some brief remarks, as Mr. Boardman has dealt very comprehensively with the annual report. On reading the report, my reflection is that the report confirms that Casey is a growing municipality. The figures that drew my attention in particular were that its current population is 370,000 people, and that's projected to grow in 2040 to 500,000 people. What that shows is that this report is part of the journey that Casey is on, and that's a journey of growth. With respect to the financial aspects of council, there is one page that provides a very clear snapshot for local residents, and I commend that page if you read no other page, and that is page 36 of the report, which provides in a very clear, concise manner a breakdown of how rates are spent. And I won't go through it, but it's there in a very easy way to read, showing just how the money is used. So with those remarks, I second the motion and I commend the report.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. I'd just like to add a few comments before I put the motion to the vote, and that is I too have only been part of the organisation for part of the year, as Mr. Boardman pointed out, since I was appointed towards the end of February. I think it's worthy of note. The annual report is a very good document for the community to review and to read. It does set out, as you've eloquently highlighted, Mr. Boardman, the detailed program of services, construction, infrastructure improvement, as well as the growth and expansion of Casey quite well. And it's a very accessible document, so I do commend the officers who have put this together. I think it's a very good read. It's an accessible document, and it gives a very strong appraisal of the range of services and work undertaken by the City of Casey. I also note that it's been a year of significant change for the organisation. with the changes related to the appointment of the panel after the sacking of the council by the Minister for Local Government. And on top of that, obviously, the very restricted operations changes related to COVID-19. So it's been a year of considerable change, of adaptation, of agility and flexibility. So I do commend and thank Mr. Patterson once again and his team for the work that they've done during the past year. It's been very challenging for all of the organisation during the 2019-20 year. So on that note, I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Thank you. Item 5.2 is very topical, the COVID-19 Action Plan, supporting building, construction and development, and I seek a mover for the recommendation.
I'll move the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar, and seconded, Mr. Boardman.
Seconded.
Mr. Belmar, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, if I could just make some brief remarks about this plan. I commend the plan to the community. The City of Casey COVID-19 Action Plan has 3 parts, are now next and beyond to what the City of Casey is doing with respect to signalling to the construction industry that Casey is doing what it can in the COVID environment to ensure that that the appropriate steps are taken to give confidence to the building and development community that Casey is continuing to be open for business and for development. The plan attached to the paper set out that there has been steps taken between April and May 2020 when the COVID issues first came to light, and the steps that were taken at that time to properly adapt to what was occurring in that period. The next part of the plan relates specifically to business acceleration and resilience, and we're in that part of the plan at the moment. And when I review the papers, my takeaway from that is that what Council is seeking to do is to ensure that it's properly managing, properly accounting for and properly deploying its DCP funds in a way that ensures that building and construction continues to occur within the City of Casey. I also note that one of the policies is to streamline as much as it can, obviously in keeping with all legislative requirements, the processes of approvals. Now, that's a key factor in ensuring that building and construction can occur, because bottlenecks can exist in development approvals, and Casey is giving an undertaking to ensure that, obviously keeping with all legislative requirements, it's doing as much as it can to ensure that they do not in any way create barriers. This the last part of the plan is the beyond part of the plan, and really here we're looking at the big picture. And if I can reflect on one part of that, and that is that the City of Casey seeks to participate in the South East Melbourne City deal. Now that is a major piece of work that's being undertaken by Council, and ensuring that there is alignment by the City of Casey, planning, investment and governance between all 3 levels of government that are necessary to accelerate growth. I commend the policy to Council and to the meeting as demonstrating that the City is approaching the challenges of COVID in a way that will allow it to respond and to be agile in the way that it continues to encourage building and construction in the city to ensure that the growing community is properly serviced by the continuing delivery of those services.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman.
Thank you, Chair. Just briefly following on from my colleagues' comments, this is an indication of where Council is very much moving towards its efforts into the COVID and particularly the economic recovery. We don't choose to have a debate around the impact, appropriateness or measurement of current and past restrictions. But what we do need to do is provide that clarity and consistency to our developer community, and that can be developers at a residential level, whether it's mum and dads and families accessing homeowners grants or home renovation grants, or it could be at a large scale level, to ensure that we are not providing undue regulatory burden or bureaucracy. We're providing the clarity that applies equally to all applications, that allows the confidence and allows applications to be considered time efficiently and equitably. But most importantly, we're doing it from that consistency basis, that we are considering all the viewpoints from the proponents, from the community, from any other affected or impacted party, to ensure that we are promoting the right level of economic activity and growth. We are providing the right balance of amenity and recreational consistency to our residents, and that all the connectivity aspects, whether it's the built environment, whether it's transport, whether it's retail, whether it's hospitality, whether it's any other aspect of facility that communities expect us to provide, we are doing that. And that's what this action plan is. We were, as a panel, very impressed that the consideration, the thoroughness and the proactivity that was applied to this particular plan was obvious in its development and is obvious in its presentation publicly. And with those comments, and for the specific now, next and beyond measures that Mr. Belmar has articulated, I'm also equally delighted to support the recommendation and to commend the officers in not just having a very pragmatic approach to considering and promoting and facilitating future development applications, but being true to what we actually want to try and do as a council and as a municipality as a whole.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. I too support this, and it is, as you've said, it's getting on the front foot and being clear in the messaging with the building and construction community and the broader community as to the importance of those commitments. So I put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Now move on to item 5.3, proposed art gallery and restaurant. Do I have a mover?
Chair, I would like to move an amendment to the recommendation, if I could, please.
Yes, I do believe we have that. And if we could put that up on the screen. And I'll just wait for that to come onto the screen.
Sure. And when it comes on the screen, I will read the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman.
I don't see it on the screen, so I might start.
Okay, if you go ahead and read it, and it'll come onto the screen.
So I want to replace the recommendation in the public council papers with the following, and I will read this verbatim. 1, that council endorses the submission for C273 case, Rosemale Gallery, generally in accordance with attachment 1, and submit it to the Ministerial Amendment C273 Case Advisory Committee. 2, that council highlights and emphasises the following matters throughout the advisory committee process. A, reiteration of the strong support for the proposed development and its potential positive contribution to arts, cultural and economic development in the City of Casey and in the State of Victoria. B, the importance of addressing and responding to community concerns such as infrastructure needs, traffic impacts, car parking, equestrian trail usage, protecting vegetation and wildlife, bushfire management and general amenity, brackets such as noise, close brackets. C, that in order to fulfil its purpose as set out in the terms of reference for the C273 case, the advisory committee must give appropriate weight, regard and consideration to the concerns raised by the community and respond accordingly through a stringent review of conditions that address matters identified above. That is the amendment.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder?
I'll second that.
Mr. Belmar, would you like to speak to your motion, Mr. Boardman?
I would like to speak to the motion, and I will take some of the panel's time to do so, and I'm sure that yourself, Chair, and Mr. Belmar would also like to make some comments in regards to this. And I commence by commending the community for the thoroughness of the consideration of this particular matter, the way that they have engaged with us and the council as a whole, and brought some very important issues to our attention, which I trust has been reflected in the amendment that I've just moved, but also give you an indication and confidence that we have considered those very significant issues and that we are committed to ensure that the community and your issues are represented as equitably and appropriately as possible in this process. I do want to start with two specific comments. My first comment that in the current environment and considering the previous agenda item, any proposal of private sector investment that is going to be a substantial economic multiplier, particularly as it relates to further economic and particularly employment growth in the municipality from a principled perspective, must be supported. And I don't think that there would be many people in the community that would disagree with what I've just said. That providing such a proposal complies with the planning scheme, complies with usage requirements, complies with other requirements. The general principle from the municipality must be that we have to support that proposal. But of course, it needs to be seen through the lens of what the impact will be from the community and what other implications such a proposal may actually have. The second comment that I want to make is that I can understand why the community in such volume and with such consistency does have some significant and legitimate concerns to this particular matter. When researching this proposal and trying to look at comparable developments, both in a Victorian sense and nationally, and even nationally, there's not many that come to mind, but one that of course does come to mind is the Museum of Old and New Art, MONA, as it's known, located in Berrydale, a suburb of Hobart, which was developed in 2011, an initial $75 million renovation of the former Morella Museum of Antiquities. And not dissimilar to this particular proposal, it is an art gallery that's a public art gallery. It's currently free to residents of Tasmania. Those of us from interstate have to pay to attend it. It did start its life as a winery, as a microbrewery, as a hospitality venue, and of course has now grown to the art gallery, a boutique hotel, and there's certainly plans for future developments on that particular site. It's not dissimilar because it is in a residential area of Hobart where there's no question that accessibility and the impact to local residents has increased dramatically since its construction. And it should be noticed that in 2017, MONA's attendance climbed 44% to 1.3 million people. And that includes over 10,000 visitors over 3 days for the Mona Foma concerts, which are held during the summer in Hobart. So you can completely understand why some of the residents in Harkaway and beyond would have some reservations about this particular proposal and the process that is being undertaken. But by saying that is that Mona has adapted to meet the expectations of the community. Transport has been addressed, obviously, with improvements to the road and the addition of additional transport such as the ferry and other public transport such as the buses and so forth. And there's been other amendments on the sites to try and get that balance between community concern and visitation and other requirements. Now, what the Rose and Maurice Hogg Gallery Limited is proposing is something not dissimilar, but obviously in a very different location that undoubtedly is going to have some significant impacts upon the community. But by the same token, it's going to have some very positive impacts to the municipality, to the state, and arguably to the country as a whole. It's not that often that you get $500 million of art that is considered to be of state significance donated from a private investor who also is going to be contributing investment to create a facility to put it on public exhibition and the commensurate hospitality and other facilities that will go with this development to really give not just Casey something to be very proud of in a community sense, but the state and the country as a whole. So I just want to turn a little bit to some of the specific concerns that have been raised by the community, if I could please, Chair. And in doing so, I'm going to look at this through a chronology, through what actually has been Council's involvement in this process and what is the current process and what's Council roles now and into the future. And the first time that this proposal came to Council's attention was in September 2017. And it should be noticed that like a number and very appropriately of private sector investments, because of obvious confidentiality aspects and other competition requirements, it is important that Council does take a very sensitive view of such matters. And the Council at that time, and I agree was appropriate, did decide to consider this initial approach in a closed council meeting. But as observers to our processes would note, that at our previous council meeting on the 6th of October, we made a decision unilaterally and proactively recommended by the council officers to release the minutes of the meetings previously held in 2018 and 2019 related to this particular issue. We wanted to be transparent with what council's role had been previously, and we wanted to ensure that our dealings as an organisation with the proponent and with other stakeholders had been completely consistent with our requirements and those requirements under the Planning and Environment Act. So council did receive, as I said, initial approach in 2017. Declarations have been made around council officers who have met with the proponents, and I'm satisfied that those declarations are absolutely in accordance with declarations and other regulatory requirements. And as I said, it was first considered at the closed meeting on the 7th of August 2018, whereby the council wrote to the state government to support a ministerial amendment process for Rosemere, which was also requested by the proponent at that particular time. It wasn't until 2019, after the first refusal from the state government in October 2018, that we came back to council, and council then wrote again to the minister referring this particular matter and supporting a ministerial amendment process. This again was also requested by the owners and, as I've stated, an appropriate way in which to deal with this matter. So 2 years later, it was not until the Rosemere Advisory Committee was established on the 30th of August of this year, and considering what documents we have now released and the process that council's undertaken to date, I trust that the community has seen that because of the state significance of this project, the magnitude of the investment and the potential implications to a range of stakeholders, referring it to an advisory committee is absolutely the most appropriate way of doing that. The advisory committee has been formed, and on the planning.vic.gov.au website, all of the documents, all of the accompanying material, the supporting analysis by the engaged engineers, vegetation managers, safety managers, traffic and other consultants on behalf of the proponent are there for public display, and I trust that those members of the community that are concerned and have an interest in this matter, like myself, have read those reports and understand that there is very serious consideration and analysis around some of the issues that have been raised by the community and validly need to be further interrogated through this particular process. And considering the interest that this matter has generated, not just with ourselves, but also through the public exhibition process, it should be noticed that that process itself has been extended from what was due to be closing this Friday on the 23rd of October. It has been extended to the 6th of November, and the dates for directions hearings will be on the 26th of November, with the public hearings starting as scheduled on the week of the 18th of January. As the Chair outlined in her responses to the questions, we are not the responsible authority to make a decision on this particular process. We are a stakeholder. And whilst we are in support of the proposal because of, as we have stated, the cultural, the economic and the other benefits that this proposal will bring to the municipality, we equally recognise those very legitimate and very sound concerns that are raised by the community. And that's why we have moved the amendment to put the conditions and to qualify our submission to the Planning Committee appropriately. But I just need to conclude with a few very key points. There will be 146 construction jobs created in this process, with 149 ongoing jobs. That is too great a gift to the City of Casey, and potentially, considering some of the employment challenges and other economic challenges that the municipality will be facing in the very near and middle term future, that we cannot afford to refuse. And I thank the proponents for acknowledging that an investment such as this scale will be such a significant economic and employment contributor, and one which undoubtedly will provide opportunities for not just our young people, for those who probably need to look at such a development for future employment prospects. But I also note that the concerns around the traffic management, the vegetation, and certainly the amendments that have already been proposed through the car park, and place on the record that one of the questions around the independent analysis that we have undertaken has indeed been considered internally around what will happen on King Road itself and from a traffic management perspective. It's estimated in the proponents' independent analysis that there will be around about 250 passenger movements per day, but there is a maximum of 430 people allowed on the premises at any one time. And the independent analysis around traffic management and flow on King Road at this stage suggests that the traffic management in a worst case scenario will have a double impact to what is the daily monitored and assessed traffic volume at this particular stage. I think that is manageable. And whilst, again, I certainly understand the concerns of the community, to look at the veracity and the detail that exists within the publicly exhibited documents and the independent analysis by the proponent and the analysis that we have completed internally by our own officers and ourselves as administrators, I do go back to my opening comments. This is an application that does require broad support. It does need to be qualified on the basis of the amendments and the conditions which are very valid to ensure that community amenity and some of those aspects are considered thoroughly by the panel. But it also is a process that is very appropriate in the circumstance. And whilst we have been very thoughtful and forthright in considering what the community has provided to us by virtue of those concerns, it is not our decision to make. And the panel process will allow any objector, any advocate, or any other member of the community to attend those public hearings, either by themselves or to be represented, and further interrogate the veracity, the appropriateness and legitimacy of what the proponent and his advisors is proposing. That is a very transparent, a very measured and a very democratic way of dealing with this particular matter. If the planning committee does recommend to the Minister for Planning that a planning permit be issued and it does come back to council, then I'm sure that we will view that favourably in consistency with whatever conditions are imposed. But with those comments, Chair, and considering the thoroughness of the work that we as administrators have embarked upon for several months now on this particular matter, I am pleased to move my amendment giving support to the concept and the proposal as submitted in the documents accompanying the public council papers, but also noting the legitimate and worthwhile concerns of the community and to recommend to the panel to consider all of those contributions equitably and validly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar, I invite you to speak to the motion.
Thank you, Chair. In seconding this motion, I'm mindful that what appears on the screen is an amended motion that's been moved by Mr. Boardman, which I'm seconding because I have carefully considered the proposal, and in doing so as an administrator, I carefully consider this proposal with respect to the entire community of Casey. And in doing that, I am mindful and respectful of the objections that have been raised and the matters that have been addressed at the start of this meeting this afternoon by the Chair in answering those questions. But I'm mindful that this is a proposal that will impact the entire municipality. Like Mr. Boardman, I am aware of the economic driver that a project like this will offer the broader community. And I'm mindful also of the experience, the quite apt experience that is offered to this community by the Mona development. Now, this is not the Mona development, this is a different development, and I encourage community members to review the papers, to look at the architecture and to consider the proposal in its entirety. And in doing so, what the community will see, in my view, is a carefully thought out and carefully planned proposal for a site that is appropriate with conditions. And that's, for me, is the key factor in me supporting this motion this evening. And that is that in supporting this motion, what what I believe will be occurring, what I'm sure will be occurring at the planning panel, is that council officers will be advocating the position that is set out on screen, and that is they'll be advocating a position that any ultimate approval that is given to this, if approval is given, because that's an if, will include the considerations that are being put forward by council. And they relate specifically to the issues that appear there on the screen. They relate to the issues of traffic. They relate to the issues of infrastructure. They relate to the issues of protecting vegetation and wildlife. And they are all very legitimate concerns. But if planning has taught me anything, is that planning requires careful balancing of a number of interests to arrive at an outcome that is an acceptable outcome. It may not be a perfect outcome, but it has to be an acceptable planning outcome. And I am satisfied on reading the material that if the conditions that council is seeking are adopted, then through a proper balancing exercise, which every planning question must turn on, that an appropriate acceptable outcome can be achieved. And so for those reasons, the fact that jobs will be created, the fact that I'm supporting this, keeping in mind the entirety of Casey, I am supporting this motion this evening, and I'm commending it to the community.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. I too support the motion put by Mr. Boardman, and in supporting the motion, I just want to make a few comments. And firstly, my support centres around the economic benefits and the state significance of the collection, particularly in light of the state economics that we're facing currently. But as Mr. Belmar has stated, the balancing issues need to be an appropriate set of conditions that relate to both the establishment and the operation of the gallery, and they will require some considerable deliberation by the advisory committee. I do note that the advisory committee is, in my view, the appropriate mechanism to consider this matter, this planning scheme amendment, this specific site amendment, and it will be led by experts in the planning field, as members of that advisory committee have been appointed. It is a very transparent and accessible process, and it's accessible particularly for objectors to submit and be heard, as Mr. Belmar has said. I do believe that it is the appropriate mechanism, and I think that the consideration that the council has given in adopting this motion is an attempt to balance out those at times competing demands on sites and applications. So with those comments, I will put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Thank you. Now move on to item 5.4, 34 Emu Way, Narre Warren South. Do I have a mover for the recommendation?
Yes, I will move that.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar, and seconded Mr. Boardman. Thank you. Mr. Belmar, I invite you to speak to the motion.
Yes, Chair, I'll just need to make my way momentarily through the papers.
Certainly.
This is a motion in which I am moving that a notice of decision issue from Council in support of a 2-unit development at 34 Emu Way in Narre Warren South. On my reading of the documentation, this is a proposal for 2 townhouses in the general residential zone. It's a proposal that has been carefully considered by council officers. I note that there are a number of objections to the proposal. In my reading of the documents, council officers have carefully considered each of those objections, and they relate to matters, proper matters, such as traffic and neighbourhood character, landscaping, and town planning questions of that nature. And again, demonstrating that town planning is always an exercise that relates to balancing competing interests and arriving at an acceptable outcome. I am of the view that through the conditions that are proposed in the notice of decision, that an acceptable planning outcome can be achieved, and therefore I am supporting this motion with the conditions that are proposed in the notice of decision. And if I can end on this point, and that is that the notice of decision demonstrates that council is willing to support this development on conditions. So just returning to that point that council supports developments, but it imposes conditions on developments. So it's vital for the community to understand that in doing so, council imposes those conditions by carefully considering the planning scheme and then addressing the concerns of the objectors and looking at them through the lens of the planning scheme. And that's what those conditions reflect. So with those comments, I move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman, anything to add?
Just very briefly, Chair, and as Mr. Belmar's pointed out, it is a balancing act. This matter has come to our attention because the volume of objectors was more significant than the threshold that would otherwise not trigger it coming to our attention. There was an objectors meeting held on the 22nd of September, which was attended between council officers and 7 of the objecting parties. The conditions on page 172 of the council papers again demonstrate, as Mr. Belmar has pointed out, the considerations that we will undertake to ensure that there is equity between and a balance between proponents and objectors to ensure that there is all of those aspects regarding noise, amenity, traffic, accessibility, etc. And in this case, noise and privacy that are addressed hopefully to everyone's expectations and consistency. It is a matter that is of a slightly different scale to the previous agenda item, but certainly no less important considering the volume of objectors. And I trust that that how we have dealt with this transparently and consistently with policy gives confidence to the objectors that we are representing all of the views of the community equitably and making sensible decisions as a consequence. And I am, for that reason, pleased to support the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. And as has been noted, there are some significant conditions that have been developed in response to that discussion and meeting with the objectors, particularly the site's setback and a range of other conditions. So I too support the recommendation, and I put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Thank you. Item 5.5, road discontinuance Central Parkway, Cranbourne West. Do I have a mover for the recommendation?
Yes, I'll move that.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. And seconder, Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar, I invite you to speak to item 5.5.
Yes, this is a motion which is visible from the screen as somewhat a procedural motion with respect to a council selling a piece of land. I'm satisfied on review of the documents that the appropriate legislative process has been undertaken in identifying whether or not any objectors exist. I note that a public notice was made and that no submissions were received by council. I turn also to the fact that in ensuring any property disposal, there are 3 particular tests that are used. The first is a test to confirm that the existing property purpose is no longer required to deliver the current or future service needs. Secondly, would it not qualify to be acquired under the acquisition policy and objectives for another council service? And can it be demonstrated that a maximised market value and value for money is achieved? I'm satisfied on review of the papers that each of those matters is properly addressed and it is appropriate for the sale of this piece of land to proceed. And I note that the sale will occur to a neighbouring landowner. And for those reasons, I commend the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman, anything to add?
I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay, I'll put that motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.6 is disposal of land, Valletta Street in Clyde. Do I have a mover for the recommendation? Thank you, Mr. Belmar. And a seconder, Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar?
Thank you, Chair. Again, this is another procedural motion, but it is of no less importance to the members of the community who are affected by this motion we're moving tonight. And it's for that reason that I'm speaking to it and speaking to it carefully, like I do to every motion. Again, with this item on the agenda, I am satisfied that the appropriate legislative requirements have been addressed. They are the ones that are relevant to the motion I've just spoken to previously, that it is a piece of land that is appropriate for disposal and that it is being disposed of by council in the appropriate manner for an appropriate value. And so for those reasons, I commend the motion. And again, I note that it is being disposed of to a neighbouring landowner, and in many respects, what this motion does is it confirms a state of fact that has occurred for some time, and it's appropriate that council take steps like this to ensure that it does not have land on its register that is not required, and that appropriate value is achieved for council in those circumstances. And for those reasons, and in support of that policy being pursued by council officers, I move this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Anything to add, Mr. Boardman?
Likewise, I have nothing to add.
Thank you. I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. And item 5.7, the Audit and Risk Committee Charter. Do I have a mover for the recommendation?
I will move that, Chair.
Mr. Boardman, and seconded Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman, please speak to the motion.
Certainly, well, as the newly appointed member of the Audit and Risk Committee, it's appropriate that I do move the adoption of the revised charter as proposed. It is a requirement under Section 54 of the Local Government Act. And I would like to again place on record our appreciation to Mr. Rob Bennett, the outgoing chair, and Mr. Vince Philpott, an outgoing independent member of the Audit and Risk Committee, for their service over a number of years, and thank them very much on behalf of the entire organisation. This charter has been reviewed as part of our ongoing overall governance review of our effectiveness and operational efficiency. We have made a number of changes which clarify the requirements and expectations in the operations of the Audit and Risk Committee, and in doing so, we would hope that the future committee will act to a similar, if not higher standard than previous committees, and certainly in comparison with what we see as other municipalities, we want to set a benchmark on operational effectiveness with such a committee. It is important, Chair, to note that we are undergoing a unique process to replace Mr. Bennett and Mr. Philpott. Normally, councils would go through a public advertised role. We have eschewed that at this juncture, opting for a candidate search and selection exercise. We have engaged an independent search organisation to conduct that for us. And a number of candidates have been identified and put forward to us for further consideration. And we do note, Chair, that the quality of potential candidates that the council is targeting to fulfil those two vacancies is of an exceptionally high standard, and probably candidates which normally would not have considered to be involved in local government processes, and certainly not an Audit and Risk Committee. But if we are successful in attracting such candidates, it will bring a diversity and a depth of experience that I don't think this and other municipalities have had. And for that, we are not just very encouraged by the initial research and feedback from the search agency, but of just the approach that I think we have undertaken to really look at this through a very different lens, which again, hopefully will form a benchmark for other municipalities to follow. So the charter, once adopted, if adopted this afternoon, will set the standards, expectations and guidelines of the incoming committee. It will serve as a reference point for the incoming chair and myself and Mr. Simon Marnie and the newly appointed independent member to ensure that we are supporting the council with all of those mechanisms required to run a successful audit and risk process. And with those brief comments, Chair, I am pleased to support the recommendation and adopt the charter.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I'll just make some brief remarks. Part of the legacy that I think all the administrators I'm appointed wish to leave to council is processes and policies that achieve proper management of financial matters and other risk matters. The policy that we're adopting tonight is one of the documents that can do that. As Mr. Boardman has also addressed, we're in the process of seeking candidates for the new committee, and like Mr. Boardman, I'm mindful that that process seems that it will be able to deliver a very diverse and very highly qualified committee, and it's appropriate that those future members have before them a clearly articulated policy such as the charter, in fact the charter that we are adopting tonight, which will give them the direction that they'll be able to follow in their task of being an audit and risk committee. But I'm also mindful of the fact that as an audit and risk committee, they will be exercising their own independent discretion, and that this policy will guide them, but ultimately we are reliant on the expertise of the people appointed to ensure that the tasks that they are required to carry out are carried out to the highest standard. And for those reasons, I commend the charter and the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. And I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. That concludes our officer reports this afternoon. I move to item 6, which is consideration of reports of committees, and I note the record of discussion as listed in the agenda papers. Item 7 is petitions, and we have received no petitions for this council meeting. Item 8 is urgent business, and again there are no urgent business items. And item 9 is the closed council meeting. Pursuant to section 3(5) of the Local Government Act 2020, our Chief Executive Officer has determined that the report listed below and attachments are confidential in accordance with that section of the Act for the reasons specified above. That's item 1, planning matter. And the recommendation is that Council resolve to move into closed council. Do I have a mover to move into closed council?
I'll move that.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar, and a seconder. Mr. Boardman, put to the vote. Carried. Thank you. So for that, thank you to members of the community for your participation in the meeting this afternoon. I declare the meeting closed, and thank you for being here. Thank members of the panel and officers for their participation and support, and we look forward to seeing you at the next council meeting. Good afternoon.